Hey there! Tonight, we're diving into something grim, bloody, and historically messy. That's right, the moments when humanity looked in the mirror, screamed, and then doubled down on the chaos. Not the awkward first dates or mild political scandals. No, we're talking about massacres, genocides, disasters, and collapses so dramatic they make your worst day look like a gentle nap. Welcome to 100 Most Disturbing Events in History to Fall Asleep, to a bedtime story of tragedy, terror, and the occasional incompetent monarch. So before we crack open the history book soaked in tears and irony, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you've got the stomach for it. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, what time it is, and which nightmare chapter of history you secretly want me to whisper about next. Spoiler, none of them end well. Now dim the lights, pull the blankets tight, and maybe leave one eye open. Tonight's journey is historically questionable and very, very disturbing. The ancient world wasn't just dusty scrolls, marble columns, and philosophers in togas. It was also full of fire, blood, and the kind of casual cruelty that would make even modern cynics wince. Take Nineveh, for instance, once the jewel of Assyria, a sprawling city famous for its towering walls and intimidating armies. In 612 BCE, it became a cautionary tale in bricks and ashes. The combined forces of the Babylonians and Medes breached the walls after a long siege, slaughtered its inhabitants, and burned it to the ground so thoroughly that for centuries historians argued over whether it had really existed at all. The Assyrian Empire, once the terror of the Near East, vanished almost overnight, swallowed by flames and the satisfying revenge of every neighbor they'd ever bullied. Then there's Carthage, the North African powerhouse that dared to challenge Rome. After 3 brutal Punic wars, Rome decided enough was enough. In 146 BCE, Roman legions stormed the city, systematically slaughtered the defenders, enslaved the survivors, and supposedly salted the earth, though the salt part is probably a myth invented later, because the Romans didn't really need extra flair to make it horrifying. What isn't a myth is that Carthage was erased, its libraries burned, its culture snuffed out to make room for Roman hegemony. The message was clear: oppose Rome and disappear forever. Meanwhile, far north in the Germanic forests, the Romans themselves met their own bloody reckoning. In 9 CE, at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, an alliance of Germanic tribes ambushed and annihilated 3 entire Roman legions. Led by Arminius, a Germanic leader who'd once served in the Roman ranks, the ambush was so complete that the Romans lost roughly 20 men in a matter of days. Skulls were nailed to trees as trophies. Rome's expansion into Germania effectively halted their imperial appetite, blunted by the ghosts of that haunted forest. Across the Mediterranean, another famous cultural wound was inflicted not on a people, but on human knowledge itself. The burning of the Library of Alexandria remains one of history's most legendary tragedies, though historians still debate exactly how many times it burned and who lit the match each time. Whether it was Julius Caesar's men in 48 BCE, later Roman zealots, or invading Arabs centuries afterward, what matters is the idea. Thousands of scrolls, painstakingly copied by generations, reduced to ash. Mathematics, astronomy, poetry, philosophy, gone in smoke and rumor. It remains one of history's most haunting what-ifs. Finally, the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, where the Roman Empire, determined to crush a Jewish revolt, laid waste to one of the ancient world's most sacred cities. After a brutal siege that starved the population, Roman soldiers breached the walls and unleashed weeks of slaughter. The Second Temple, the center of Jewish worship, was burned and destroyed, an act so cataclysmic it reshaped the Jewish faith and diaspora forever. Blood reportedly ran ankle-deep in the streets, though Roman sources might have embellished. If anything, the truth was likely worse. These ancient atrocities weren't footnotes. They were tectonic shifts, moments where entire civilizations cracked, burned, or vanished entirely. Their echoes still haunt ruins, texts, and the collective nightmares of history nerds everywhere. So rest easy tonight, knowing your city probably won't be sacked by torch-wielding invaders, probably. The reign of Caligula began with hope and ended with horror, the kind that makes later historians wonder if the empire itself needed therapy. When young Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, nicknamed Caligula, Little Boots, took the throne in 37 CE, the Roman people cheered for a new golden age. Instead, they got a ruler who treated executions like party tricks, declared himself a living god, and once allegedly planned to appoint his horse as consul, partly to humiliate the Senate, partly because he may have genuinely liked the horse more than humans. Ancient sources claim he delighted in torturing aristocrats, bankrupting nobles, and building lavish floating palaces while common Romans starved. Eventually, even his closest guards grew tired of the blood-soaked circus, stabbing him to death in a corridor to end what might be the empire's most notorious meltdown. Then came Nero, another imperial showman with a taste for destruction. In 64 CE, a fire broke out in Rome, raging for days and consuming much of the city. Rumors swirled that Nero himself ordered the blaze so he could clear land for a grand palace, though others argue he simply did nothing while the city burned. Either way, he stood atop a tower singing about Troy's destruction while flames devoured entire districts. Afterwards, he blamed Christians for the disaster, ordering mass executions in grotesque public spectacles. The fire wasn't the empire's last, but it was the one that cemented Nero's place in the hall of infamous tyrants. The chaos continued under Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, supposedly the philosopher king. Commodus inherited Rome's might and promptly transformed it into a vanity project. He fancied himself Hercules reborn, fighting in the arena for sport, slaughtering animals and occasionally humans while dressed in lion skins. He demanded statues of himself across the empire, extorted the Senate, and terrified the aristocracy into silence. Rome shifted from a cautious empire to the personal playground of an unhinged gladiator king. Eventually, his inner circle had enough and strangled him in his bath, but the damage to Rome's prestige and sanity was already done. Then came Adrianople in 378 CE, a battle so disastrous that historians still consider it a turning point. Rome faced a massive Gothic force near the city of Adrianople. Emperor Valens, ignoring advice to wait for reinforcements, charged in. The Goths encircled his army, slaughtered over 2/3 of Rome's eastern field force, and possibly burned Valens alive in a farmhouse. The defeat shattered Rome's reputation of invincibility and cracked open the borders for barbarian incursions that never stopped. The beginning of the end had arrived. Finally, in 476 CE, the Western Roman Empire officially collapsed. A Germanic general deposed Romulus Augustulus, ironically named after Rome's legendary founder, and the Roman Senate meekly sent the imperial regalia east to Constantinople, acknowledging the empire's western corpse. No heroic last stand, just paperwork, bribes, and the final whimper of an empire that once ruled the known world. The fall wasn't clean. It was a slow bleed of corruption, betrayal, and complacency, 1,000 tiny cuts that killed Rome long before the final blow. Thus ended the age of Roman dominion, replaced by the churning chaos of the Middle Ages. And in the ruins of marble and dust, the world learned how empires die, not with a bang, but with centuries of rot, paranoia, and the casual cruelty of men who believed themselves gods. The Viking raid on Lindisfarne in 793 wasn't just theft, it was an omen. Monks were slaughtered or dragged away, holy relics torn from altars, books burned or thrown into the sea. In an instant, the quiet sanctuary turned into an abattoir, the North Sea wind carrying news of the horror across Europe. It was the beginning of centuries of Viking terror. Coastal towns that once prayed in peace now scanned the horizon for sails edged with fire. The Albigensian Crusade in 1209 was supposed to purge heresy in southern France. Instead, it became a bloodbath. Béziers, a city of thousands, was given a choice: hand over the Cathars or suffer the sword. The citizens refused. What followed was wholesale slaughter. Men, women, Children burned alive in churches, cut down in the streets. The papal legate famously told the Crusaders, "Kill them all, God will know his own." No one was spared. In 1258, Baghdad was the jewel of the Islamic world. Libraries, scholars, trade, art. Then the Mongols came. Hulagu Khan's army encircled the city and demanded surrender. Baghdad hesitated, believing its walls strong and its reputation enough to buy peace. They were wrong. The Mongols breached the walls, and a week of unimaginable slaughter followed. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, died. The Tigris ran black with ink from the destroyed House of Wisdom, red with blood from Baghdad's citizens. The city never recovered. Acre fell in 1291, marking the end of the Crusader states. European knights had clung to this last fortress in the Holy Land, but the Mamluks were patient and methodical. As walls crumbled under siege engines, defenders who couldn't flee were butchered in the streets or dragged off to slavery. Crusader dreams of Jerusalem faded with the smoke rising from burning houses. Almost a century earlier, in 1191, Richard the Lionheart had carried out his own massacre at Acre. Frustrated by stalled negotiations with Saladin, he ordered the execution of nearly 30 Muslim prisoners outside the city, wallsmen, women, and children. Heads tumbled into the dust, watched by Crusader knights drinking wine as though the killing were sport. The desert wind blew away the stench of blood. From Viking raids to religious purges, from Mongol conquest to Crusader atrocities, the Middle Ages never lacked for brutality. These massacres were not unique, not even particularly unusual in their time. They were part of a world where faith, power, and fear collided, and where entire cities could vanish into ash in the name of gods and kings. Tonight, let that reminder lull you to sleep. History has always been eager to trade thousands of lives for a line in a chronicle. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347 like an invisible army, with no banner, no face, and no mercy. Fleas jumped from rat to human, carrying a bacterium that tore through bodies with boils, fevers, and delirium. Cities emptied. Villages vanished. Entire families were buried in mass graves dug by priests too terrified to pray for the dead. In some places, corpses lay where they fell, the living too weak or afraid to move them. The plague killed an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population in just a few short years, rewriting the continent's social and economic fabric in rivers of blood and sorrow. Almost 8 centuries earlier, the Justinian plague struck Constantinople in 541 CE. The Eastern Roman Empire had weathered countless wars, but it was not prepared for Yersinia pestis. Ships brought it from Egypt, hidden in grain shipments. The city, packed and fetid, turned into a necropolis in weeks. Emperor Justinian himself fell ill but survived, only to watch his empire crumble under the weight of death. Some chroniclers claimed the bodies piled so high they were stuffed into towers or tossed into the sea, where they floated until the tide rotted them apart. Not all plague spread through rats and fleas. In 1518, the city of Strasbourg witnessed the dancing plague, an outbreak of compulsive, frenzied movement that left dozens dead from exhaustion, heart attack, or stroke. It began with one woman dancing in the street. Soon, others joined her, unable to stop their own feet. Musicians were hired to play, hoping to ease the victims into stillness. It didn't work. For weeks, the city pulsed with the sound of dying breath beneath stamping heels. Across the Atlantic, the Cocolistli epidemic struck Mexico in the 16th century with horrifying ferocity. It followed the Spanish conquest, arriving like a punishment written in blood. Fever, bleeding from the eyes and mouth, and swift death tore through indigenous communities, already devastated by conquest and enslavement. Entire towns disappeared. Some estimates put the death toll near 15 million, wiping out up to 80% of the native population, and forever shifting the balance of power in the Americas. Meanwhile, in 1665, the Great Plague of London stalked the alleys and market squares with the same cold efficiency. Quarantine signs were painted on infected houses. Red crosses marked doors. and the cry of "Bring out your dead" echoed through the narrow streets. Bodies were carted away in the night, buried in pits without ceremony. The rich fled to the countryside, while the poor died in cellars and garrets, the city air thick with the smell of rot and fear. These plagues were more than mere sickness. They were moments when death itself became a neighbor, when every cough in the dark might be the start of an unstoppable chain. They remade history, toppled empires, and carved deep scars into human memory, scars we still trace, even in the comfort of modern medicine. Tonight, as you drift to sleep, remember how close that thin line between health and horror has always been. The witch hunts of history were less about magic and more about fear, suspicion, and the terrible things humans do when they think they're protecting themselves from invisible threats. In 1692, the Salem witch trials began with two young girls convulsing and shrieking that their neighbors had cursed them. Soon, the panic spread like wildfire through the small Puritan town. Spectral evidence, dreams, and gossip condemned dozens. 20 people were executed, mostly women, and one old man was pressed to death with stones for refusing to confess. Across the ocean, the Würzburg witch trials in Germany during the 1620s took hysteria to monstrous extremes. Fueled by a paranoid bishop determined to cleanse his territory, these trials ended in the execution of around 900 people, including children as young as 9. Records speak of neighbors accusing neighbors, entire families wiped out in the flames, and mass graves filled with the bodies of the condemned. The Pendle witch trials in England in 1612 unfolded with all the grim predictability of a horror story. A handful of poor women were accused of witchcraft by a local magistrate eager to make his name. Their confessions, extracted under pressure and fear, fueled one of the most famous trials in English history. 10 were hanged on the gallows in Lancaster, their bodies left swinging as a warning to others. In the Basque region of Spain, the early 17th century saw another surge of persecution. The Basque witch hunts claimed hundreds of lives, driven by inquisitors who believed the region was infested with devil worshippers. Torture was common. Confessions were extracted under threat of burning, and those accused had little hope of escape once suspicion fell on them. The Torsåker witch trials in Sweden in 1675 became one of the largest witch hunts in Scandinavian history. A Lutheran minister convinced his flock that witches were everywhere, cursing cows, spoiling milk, and corrupting the faithful. 71 people were beheaded and then burned in one massive execution, the largest witchcraft-related killing in Swedish history. Behind every one of these events was the same basic truth: fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of difference, fear of women, fear of famine, fear of death. The witch hunts weren't just about witches, they were about scapegoats, about finding someone to blame when the crops failed or the livestock died. They turned neighbor against neighbor, family against family, and left deep scars in the communities they touched. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember the cold eyes of history watching those fires burn. Remember how easy it is for a whisper to become a death sentence, for superstition to swallow reason whole. And maybe be grateful for your own age, however flawed, where magic at least requires better evidence than the ravings of a frightened crowd. Of course, here's the text. The Spanish conquest of the Aztecs began in 1519, when Hernán Cortés arrived on the shores of Mexico with a handful of soldiers, guns, and smallpox. By 1521, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan was rubble, its canals choked with corpses, and its temples looted of gold. The Spaniards used alliances with rival native tribes, superior weaponry, and brutal tactics to destroy an empire that had ruled central Mexico for centuries. It wasn't just a military conquest, it was a cultural annihilation. Temples burned, nobles slaughtered, and gods forgotten under the cross and sword. South of Mexico, the Inca Empire met a similar fate. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro ambushed and captured the Inca ruler Atahualpa during the Battle of Cajamarca. Promising to release him for a ransom of gold, Pizarro collected a room filled floor to ceiling with treasure, then killed Atahualpa anyway. The Inca Empire, weakened by civil war and disease, crumbled. Its stone cities were plundered, and its gods desecrated. Spanish rule brought forced labor, new diseases, and centuries of colonial exploitation. The massacre of Tenochtitlan stands out as one of the most horrifying chapters of the conquest. The siege lasted months, with Spanish cannons and native allies systematically dismantling the once mighty city. Water supplies were cut, starvation spread, and disease ran rampant. In the final days, tens of thousands of Aztecs died in the streets. Survivors were enslaved or sacrificed to Spanish greed. Across the Pacific, in 1945, Manila became the scene of another bloody nightmare. As American forces advanced to liberate the Philippines from Japanese occupation, the Japanese military unleashed a campaign of slaughter and terror in the city. Civilians were bayoneted, burned alive, and massacred in hospitals and churches. An estimated 100 civilians died in one of the most brutal urban battles of World War II, their bodies left piled in ruined streets. The Siege of Vienna in 1683 wasn't a massacre on the scale of Manila, but it was a defining clash between empires at the height of Ottoman expansion. The Ottomans, having pushed deep into Europe, laid siege to the city with over 100 troops. Inside, the defenders starved and waited, hoping for rescue. Finally, relief came in the form of Polish King Jan Sobieski and his famed winged hussars, who smashed into the Ottoman lines and broke the siege. The battle ended. Ottoman hopes of further expansion into Europe, but the blood spilled on both sides left a lasting scar on the continent. Empire, by its nature, comes with a price paid in blood. Whether driven by gold, religion, or sheer ambition, the stories of conquest often end the same way. Cities burned, cultures crushed, and the innocent caught in the gears of history. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, remember how empires are rarely built on honor alone. They are built on bones, often forgotten, beneath the stones of the grandest monuments. The Atlantic slave trade remains one of the longest and most horrific chapters in human history, spanning centuries and forcibly removing millions of Africans from their homes to fuel the economies of Europe and the Americas. Ships were packed so tightly with chained bodies that people suffocated, starved, or died of disease before even reaching land. Survivors faced a lifetime of bondage, brutal punishments, and a systematic stripping of identity. Generations were born into slavery, with families torn apart on auction blocks, and empires built their wealth on this relentless tide of human suffering. Next came the Belgian Congo under King Leopold II, a personal colony transformed into a nightmare. Under Leopold's rule, millions of Congolese were forced into labor to meet rubber quotas. Those who failed were mutilated. Hands were cut off as proof of punishment. Entire villages were burned, and famine followed. This so-called civilizing mission hit a dark heart of greed that led to the deaths of an estimated 10 million people. The brutality shocked even other colonial powers whose own hands were hardly clean. In Tasmania, the British arrived with convicts and settlers, and quickly turned on the island's indigenous population. What followed was systematic violence, forced relocations, and campaigns of extermination that wiped out nearly the entire Tasmanian Aboriginal community within 75 years. The last known full-blooded Tasmanian Aboriginal person, Truganini, died in 1876, though communities with Tasmanian heritage remain today despite this horrific past. Across the ocean in New Zealand, the Maori Wars raged as the British pushed for land and control. The Maori resisted fiercely, but their population was devastated by disease, land confiscation, and the superior firepower of British forces. The wars left deep scars. Villages burned, communities fragmented, and land seized under dubious treaties. The echoes of these conflicts still shape New Zealand's politics and identity, as the descendants of both colonizers and the colonized grapple with the violence buried in their soil. Lastly, the Amritsar massacre of 1919 in British-controlled India revealed the cold cruelty of empire when pushed to preserve power. British troops under General Dyer opened fire on a peaceful gathering in Jallianwala Bagh, killing hundreds and wounding more. The narrow exits were blocked, the firing continuous, the purpose clear: terrorize the population into submission. It sparked outrage across India and around the world, becoming a catalyst for the independence movement and forever staining Britain's claims of moral superiority in its imperial rule. These events, woven together by conquest, profit, and dehumanization, stand as reminders of what empires will do to maintain control. They reveal how violence was not an accident of colonialism, but a feature of it. The slave trade in the Congo's horrors, the devastation in Tasmania and New Zealand, the bloodshed at Amritsar show how imperial ambition so often dressed itself in the language of civilization while unleashing nightmares. Tonight, as you drift to sleep, remember that these stories aren't just history. Their legacy lingers in borders, cultures, and families that still bear the marks of colonial wounds. And perhaps remembering them is the first step toward healing what remains. The French Revolution began with ideals of liberty and equality, but soon spiraled into a blood-soaked nightmare known as the Reign of Terror. Led by Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, the guillotine became a daily spectacle. Nobles, commoners, priests, anyone suspected of disloyalty could be accused and executed. Over 16,000 people officially died under the blade, but thousands more perished in prisons or massacres in the countryside. Revolutionary courts operated like grim machines, where accusations and paranoia fueled an unstoppable tide of death that ultimately devoured its architects too. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Haitian Revolution erupted against the French colonial regime. Enslaved people rose up in an unprecedented revolt, fighting not just for freedom but survival. As power shifted hands, violence consumed the colony. Plantation owners massacred, reprisals against black rebels brutal, towns torched, bodies left in the sugarcane fields. It was a war of liberation soaked in horror, birthing the first Black Republic in 1804, but leaving behind an island scarred by decades of bloodshed and betrayal. In 1857, the Sepoy Rebellion exploded in British-controlled India. Sparked by anger over rifle cartridges, rumored to be greased with cow and pig, fate and insult to Hindu and Muslim, soldiers alike, it quickly grew into a widespread uprising against colonial rule. Cities fell, villages burned, and thousands died as British forces retook territory with merciless retribution. Entire populations were massacred or executed as punishment, and the rebellion's brutal suppression hardened imperial attitudes that would define British rule in India for decades. In China, the Boxer Rebellion of 1899-1901 was an explosion of rage against foreign domination and Christian missionaries. Secret societies rose up, attacking foreigners and Chinese converts. In response, the Eight-Nation Alliance invaded, laying siege to Beijing and looting the capital. Tens of thousands died in massacres on both sides, as Western powers crushed the rebellion and imposed humiliating reparations on China that deepened resentment and set the stage for future revolutions. Lastly, the Paris Commune of 1871 was a radical experiment in working-class rule that ended in carnage. After France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, Parisians declared their own government. For 2 months, they tried to remake society with new labor policies, women's rights, and anti-clerical laws. But when the French army retook the city, they did so with overwhelming force. In a single bloody week, as many as 20,000 communards were killed in street fighting or summarily executed. The dream of a people's Paris ended in smoking ruins and mass graves, leaving behind a mythic legacy that would haunt European politics for generations. These revolutions, rooted in the thirst for freedom and justice, turned quickly into spectacles of vengeance and fear. They remind us that the price of tearing down the old order can be counted not just in hope but in blood. And tonight, as you settle in, remember how easily the passion for change can transform into something darker when old structures crack and power hangs in the balance. History is rarely quiet, and revolutions almost never end gently. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in 1911 remains one of the most notorious industrial tragedies in American history. Trapped behind locked doors in a crowded New York City factory, workers, mostly young immigrant women, were unable to escape as a fire broke out and spread rapidly. The building became an inferno in minutes. Those who couldn't flee leaped from windows to certain death. By the time the flames died, 146 people had perished. Public outrage fueled labor reforms, but for the victims and their families, the change came too late. In 1871, the Great Chicago Fire leveled much of the city, burning for 2 days and nights. Sparked in a barn, allegedly by Mrs. O'Leary's cow, it destroyed more than 3 square miles and left nearly 100 people homeless. Wood-framed buildings fed the flames, which jumped streets and devoured entire neighborhoods. When the smoke cleared, more than 300 were dead, and Chicago faced the massive task of rebuilding from ashes. In 1917, the Halifax explosion shattered the Canadian port city in the blink of an eye. A French cargo ship carrying munitions collided with another vessel in the harbor. The resulting explosion was the largest man-made blast prior to nuclear weapons flattening entire districts, killing nearly 20 and wounding thousands more. The shockwave shattered windows 50 miles away. Survivors described blinding white light, followed by deadly shards of glass and fire that swept through the city like an invisible scythe. The Johnstown flood of 1889 was a catastrophe waiting to happen. A dam, poorly maintained by wealthy Pittsburgh industrialists, burst after days of heavy rain. A wall of water rushed down the valley at 40 miles per hour, obliterating everything in its path. More than 200 people died, many swept away before they could even leave their homes. In the aftermath, mangled debris and corpses littered the valley floor, fueling debates over corporate negligence and responsibility. In 1966, the Aberfan disaster stunned Britain when a mountain of coal waste collapsed onto a Welsh village. Within seconds, a slurry of black sludge engulfed a schoolhouse, homes, and roads. 116 children and 28 adults died, buried under tons of spoil. For days, rescuers clawed through the muck with bare hands, searching for survivors. The tragedy was entirely preventable. Warnings about the tip's instability had been ignored by authorities. When the grieving town demanded justice, they received token gestures and meager reparations, never enough to replace the generation lost beneath that tidal wave of black mud. Each of these disasters wasn't merely an accident of fate, but a failure of human design, greed, or neglect. They remind us how quickly prosperity turns into horror when safety is treated as optional, and how history's darkest nights are often lit by fires we set ourselves. As you drift off tonight, think of the lives lost to carelessness and the fragile lines we build between normalcy and catastrophe. The Battle of Verdun in 1916 was one of World War I's longest and bloodiest nightmares. For 10 months, French and German forces slaughtered each other over a patch of ground that ultimately changed nothing strategically. Nearly 700 men were killed, wounded, or went missing. Artillery shells churned the earth into a moonscape where bodies and mud fused together. Soldiers called it the furnace, a place where human life had the same value as scrap metal. The Armenian genocide began in 1915 under the Ottoman Empire, which ordered the systematic extermination of its Armenian minority. Over 1.5 million Armenians died through mass deportations, starvation marches into the desert, and outright massacres. Families were torn apart. Villages disappeared. Eyewitnesses spoke of endless columns of the dying, their bones bleaching the sands of Syria. It was one of the 20th century's first genocides, and a grim template for atrocities to come. In 1937, Japanese troops captured the Chinese city of Nanjing and unleashed a 6-week orgy of killing, rape, and looting that would shock the world. Historians estimate between 200 and 300 civilians were murdered. Tens of thousands of women were raped. Survivors hid among corpses, praying the next soldier would pass them by. Even decades later, the scars of the rape of Nanjing remain raw, an open wound between nations. The bombing of Dresden in February 1945 was controversial even among Allied commanders. British and American planes dropped thousands of tons of incendiaries on the medieval German city, creating a firestorm so intense it sucked the air from bomb shelters and melted asphalt. Estimates of civilian deaths range from 25 to 35 in just 2 nights. Critics still argue whether it was a necessary blow against Nazi Germany or a crime against humanity disguised as strategy. The siege of Leningrad lasted nearly 900 days from 1941 to 1944, as Nazi forces surrounded the Soviet city and cut off supplies. Starvation killed more than 1 million civilians. People ate wallpaper paste, leather belts, even each other. Despite unimaginable suffering, the city never surrendered. Survivors who lived through it called it both hell and victory, a testament to endurance amid the worst cruelty humans can inflict. These 5 events show that war rarely honors heroism or clean battles. It chews up civilians, erases cities, and turns ordinary places into charnel houses. There are no clean wars, only varying shades of horror where even the victors carry ghosts home with them. As you drift towards sleep tonight, remember how fragile peace truly is, and how quickly the world can turn to ash. The Holocaust remains the darkest testament to humanity's capacity for organized hate. Between 1941 and 1945, Nazi Germany systematically murdered 6 million Jews, alongside millions of Roma, disabled people, Slavs, and others deemed undesirable. It was bureaucratic genocide of railways, ledgers, quotas, families torn from homes, sent to ghettos, and then to death camps like Auschwitz where gas chambers waited. Survivors recalled the smell of burning flesh, the piles of shoes, the screams fading into silence. The world promised never again, but history had other plans. In Cambodia, from 1975 to 1979, the Khmer Rouge regime under Pol Pot sought to create a communist utopia by purging anyone considered impure intellectuals, teachers, city dwellers. Nearly 2 million people died from starvation, execution, and torture. The killing fields became the grim shorthand for mass graves scattered across the country, where bones still rise through the earth during monsoon season. The Bosnian genocide in the 1990s unfolded in Europe's backyard while the world watched uneasily. Serb nationalist forces carried out ethnic cleansing against Bosniak Muslims, culminating in the 1995 Srebrenica massacre, where more than 80 men and boys were slaughtered. Survivors speak of forests filled with bodies, neighbors turning on neighbors, and a community still stitching itself back together decades later. In 1994, Rwanda became hell on earth as Hutu extremists unleashed a genocidal campaign against the Tutsi minority. Over just 100 days, nearly 1 million people were hacked, beaten, and burned to death. Bodies clogged rivers, churches became slaughterhouses. International leaders hesitated, issued condemnations, but did nothing as the machetes kept swinging. The Darfur genocide began in the early 2000s in Sudan, where government-backed militias, known as the Janjaweed, targeted non-Arab ethnic groups. Villages were burned, women were raped. More than 300 died, and millions were displaced into barren refugee camps. Even today, survivors live with the trauma and uncertainty, as justice remains elusive. These 5 genocides expose the monstrous power of hatred when it becomes state policy, when neighbors turn on neighbors, and when the world looks away until the bodies pile too high to ignore. They remind us that evil is never abstract. It grows in the cracks of fear, ignorance, and indifference, and only vigilance can keep it from blooming again. As you close your eyes tonight, let these memories echo softly in the dark, a promise that some stories must never be forgotten, no matter how much they hurt. The Jonestown Massacre began with utopian dreams of racial harmony and communal living, led by Jim Jones, a charismatic preacher who convinced hundreds of followers to abandon their homes and families for a remote jungle settlement in Guyana. But the dream curdled into paranoia, armed guards, and whispered threats of mass death if anyone tried to leave. In 1978, as U.S. officials closed in, Jones ordered his congregation to drink cyanide-laced punch. Over 900 people died, including children. It was murder cloaked in faith, punctuated by the echoes of recorded speeches and dying wails. Heaven's Gate was another group that promised salvation through oblivion. In 1997, 39 members dressed identically in black, with matching Nikes laid down in bunk beds, and drank poison to catch a ride on a spaceship they believed hid behind the Hale-Bopp comet. The quiet horror of their suicide left behind a surreal scene, a house full of neatly arranged bodies covered in purple shrouds, waiting for aliens that never came. The Order of the Solar Temple claimed they were heirs to a mystical tradition, promising members ascension to a higher plane. In the 1990s, their leaders orchestrated mass murder-suicides in Canada, Switzerland, and France. Some victims were drugged and shot. Others burned alive in ritual fires meant to symbolize their journey to Sirius, a distant star they believed was their true home. Nearly 70 died across multiple incidents, their bodies arranged in cultic geometric patterns, torched with gasoline. The Manson family murders were less organized but equally chilling. In 1969, Charles Manson ordered his followers to carry out brutal killings in Los Angeles, convinced he could spark an apocalyptic race war. The most infamous victims included actress Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant, stabbed repeatedly as she begged for her unborn child's life. The blood scrawled across walls became grim symbols of a generation's lost innocence. In Uganda, the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments promised a holy apocalypse. When doomsday predictions failed to materialize, the leaders locked hundreds of followers inside a church, boarded the windows, and set it on fire. Over 500 died in the inferno in 2000, with authorities later discovering dozens more buried in mass graves. These cults share a dark thread, belief twisted into a tool for power, isolation turned into a trap, trust weaponized into mass death. They show how quickly the human need for belonging, meaning, and certainty can be corrupted by charismatic manipulators, until even self-destruction seems like salvation. Tonight, remember the soft echo of footsteps leading followers to their doom, and the chilling truth that belief, untethered from reason, can kill as surely as any sword. The atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, turned a bustling city into a scorched ruin in seconds. A blinding flash, a rising mushroom cloud, and tens of thousands of lives erased instantly. Those who survived the initial blast faced radiation sickness, burned so deep skin hung in ribbons, and a poisoned landscape that continued to kill for years. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. A city reduced to ash, families evaporated into shadows on walls, and a world forever changed by humanity's new capacity for instantaneous mass death. The bombings ended one war, but began an era of fear, a nuclear age where annihilation lurked behind every political standoff. Decades later, the promise of nuclear energy soured at Chernobyl. On April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 exploded during a safety test gone wrong. Fire poured radioactive dust into the sky, drifting across Europe, seeping into soil and bone. First responders, unaware of the danger, charged toward the glowing ruins, later dying in agony as their organs shut down. In the weeks that followed, whole towns were abandoned, leaving playgrounds eerily silent, livestock left to starve, and forests turning red from radiation. The disaster's true toll is still argued today, but tens of thousands suffered cancers, birth defects, and lifelong illness from invisible poison. The Kishtim disaster in 1957 was less known but no less horrifying. Deep in the Soviet Union, a tank of nuclear waste overheated and exploded, releasing massive amounts of radiation over the Chelyabinsk region. Villages downwind were evacuated too late, or not at all. Children played outside while glowing dust fell on their hair and clothes. Authorities suppressed information, bulldozing contaminated villages and burying them in secrecy as much as dirt. The land remains toxic to this day, nicknamed the Eastern Ural Radioactive Trace, a silent testament to human hubris. In Brazil, the Goiânia accident of 1987 began with scavengers breaking into an abandoned cancer clinic and stealing a radiotherapy machine, hoping to sell it for scrap. Inside was cesium-137, a glowing blue powder they mistook for something valuable or even magical. They carried it home, shared it with friends, and children played with it like glitter. Within days, sores and burns appeared. Dozens were hospitalized. 4 died, including a 6-year-old girl whose coffin was sealed in concrete to prevent further contamination. The city spent months cleaning radioactive dust from homes, walls, and toys, leaving entire neighborhoods uninhabitable. These nuclear nightmares reveal the terrible duality of human invention, our brilliance and our blindness. Each moment came from an attempt at progress, at ending war, at curing disease, at harnessing new power, and each ended in silent poison, skin melting, or an irradiated future. Tonight, as you drift off, remember that under every humming light bulb and reactor core lies the echo of these tragedies, reminders that our greatest achievements often carry shadows we're not ready to see. Stalin's Great Purge was a machine of paranoia that consumed the Soviet Union in the late 1930s, sweeping away military leaders, political rivals, intellectuals, and anyone unlucky enough to be accused of disloyalty. Under torture, prisoners confessed to absurd conspiracies, entire families vanished into gulags, and neighbors learned to whisper or disappear. The party devoured itself in waves of arrests and executions, leaving behind a terrified population and an empire built on silence. No one was safe. Not even the men doing the purging. Many of Stalin's loyal secret police ended up shot in the same basements they had once supervised. The purge solidified Stalin's total control, but at the cost of millions of lives and a permanent stain of blood and fear across Soviet history. The night of the long knives in Nazi Germany was shorter but just as chilling. In 1934, Hitler decided that the SA, the paramilitary thugs who had helped him rise, were now a threat. Over a few days, he ordered the SS and Gestapo to arrest and execute SA leaders, along with old political enemies and anyone inconvenient. It was ruthless housekeeping, eliminating potential rivals while showing the German public how far he would go to hold power. Hitler emerged from the purge as the unchallenged master of the Third Reich, more terrifying than ever. In China, the Cultural Revolution began in 1966 when Mao Zedong unleashed students and young radicals, the Red Guards, to attack anything old. Intellectuals were beaten in the streets, forced to wear dunce caps and confess imaginary crimes. Ancient artifacts and books were destroyed, temples burned, teachers murdered by their own students. Mao stoked chaos to keep himself in power, while families were torn apart by denunciations and violence. By the time the movement subsided, millions were dead, and Chinese society had been ripped to pieces and restitched with terror and suspicion. Kristallnacht in 1938 Germany was a public pogrom that signaled where Nazi anti-Semitism would lead. Over 2 nights, Nazi mobs smashed Jewish businesses, burned synagogues, beat and killed Jewish citizens, and arrested thousands who were shipped to concentration camps. Broken glass glittered in the streets, earning the night its name, the Night of Broken Glass. But the real horror was in how methodically it was planned and executed, a state-sponsored rehearsal for genocide that would become the Holocaust. The Katyn massacre was another grim note in the symphony of political purges. In 1940, Soviet secret police executed over 20 Polish officers, intellectuals, and community leaders, burying them in mass graves in the Katyn forest. For decades, the Soviets denied responsibility, blaming Nazi Germany, but the truth emerged slowly. Stalin had ordered the deaths to decapitate Poland's elite and eliminate resistance. It was a calculated slaughter, the silencing of a nation's future leaders, done quietly under the trees, with bullets and shovels. The Great Irish Famine began in 1845, when potato blight wiped out the staple crop of the Irish poor, but the tragedy was magnified by British policy. Exports of food continued as people starved in the streets. Workhouses overflowed, families were evicted, and entire villages emptied out from death and emigration. 1 million died, another million fled, and the scars of colonial neglect and prejudice would shape Irish identity and resentment for generations. The Holodomor in Ukraine was even more deliberate. In 1932-33, Stalin's regime requisitioned grain from Ukrainian peasants, leaving them to starve as part of a campaign to crush nationalist sentiment and resistance to collectivization. Troops blocked roads, seized hidden stores, and let children die in their homes. Historians debate whether it was genocide, but there is little debate about its horror. Millions perished while the Soviet state denied the famine even existed. The Great Chinese Famine from 1959 to 1961 was the result of Mao's Great Leap Forward, a reckless push to industrialize and collectivize agriculture. Officials inflated harvest numbers to please superiors, leading to massive grain exports, even as villagers starved. Communal kitchens ran out of food, peasants ate bark and dirt, and whole provinces were decimated. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 15 and 45 million people died in what remains the deadliest famine in human history. The Bengal famine of 1943 unfolded under British rule during World War II. British authorities diverted rice and supplies to feed troops and stockpile against potential Japanese invasion. Wartime inflation made food unaffordable, while hoarding and black markets flourished. The colonial government refused to declare a famine or intervene meaningfully, leading to the deaths of around 3 million people. Images of skeletal children and bloated corpses haunted the conscience of a world fighting fascism while ignoring imperial brutality. The North Korean famine of the 1990s, known as the Arduous March, followed the collapse of Soviet support and disastrous economic policies. Floods, mismanagement, and state indifference led to widespread starvation, while the regime maintained strict control over information and foreign aid. Hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, died. Survivors resorted to eating grass, tree bark, and, in some cases, human flesh. Even today, the true extent of the tragedy is hidden behind propaganda and secrecy, but the trauma endures in the memories of refugees and the whispered stories of those who lived through hell. The Tuskegee syphilis study began in 1932 when the U.S. Fiveless Public Health Service decided to observe the progression of untreated syphilis in black men under the guise of free medical care. Hundreds of poor sharecroppers were denied treatment even after penicillin was discovered, and researchers lied about their condition, letting them die slowly and passed the disease to partners and children. The study finally ended in 1972 after public outcry, but the damage in lives and trust remains. Unit 731 was the Japanese Imperial Army's secret biological and chemical warfare program during World War II. Prisoners, mostly Chinese civilians, were subjected to vivisection without anesthesia, deliberately infected with plague, cholera, and anthrax, frozen, starved, and experimented on in brutal ways. The atrocities rivaled any in history, but many scientists received immunity in exchange for sharing their findings with the U.S. after the war. Nazi medical experiments are infamous. Twins dissected, prisoners submerged in freezing water, wounds infected intentionally, women sterilized, children injected with chemicals. Doctors like Josef Mengele treated Auschwitz as a playground of torture under the guise of science, often fueled by racist ideology and sadism. These experiments were presented as research, but served mainly to justify genocide and inflict unimaginable pain. MK-Ultra was a CIA program launched during the Cold War that secretly dosed unwitting subjects with LSD and other drugs to study mind control. Prisoners, mental patients, soldiers, and ordinary citizens were subjected to hallucinations, psychological torture, and manipulations that sometimes ended in mental breakdown or death. Decades later, much of the documentation was destroyed, leaving behind a legacy of paranoia, conspiracy, and real human wreckage. The Radium Girls were young women hired in the early 20th century to paint watch dials with glow-in-the-dark radium paint. Told the paint was safe, they licked brushes to make fine points, ingesting tiny doses of radioactive poison day after day. Their jaws rotted away, bones crumbled, cancers bloomed, but corporate bosses denied responsibility, suppressed evidence, and fought compensation. Eventually, the women's lawsuits changed workplace safety standards, but not before dozens died in agony, glowing quite literally with the poison that made their employers rich. During the summer of 1789 in France, rumors spread like wildfire that bands of armed brigands were roaming the countryside, burning crops and killing peasants. This became known as the Great Fear. Fueled by real hunger and resentment toward nobles, panic-stricken villagers armed themselves, attacked manor houses, and destroyed tax records. The terror wasn't based on real hordes of mercenaries. The threat was mostly imaginary, but the chaos helped spark the early radicalism of the French Revolution and the collapse of feudalism in France. In 1962, in the village of Kashasha in Tanganyika, modern Tanzania, a group of schoolgirls began laughing uncontrollably. The laughter spread to nearby villages and schools, lasting weeks or months at a time, affecting hundreds of people, sometimes causing fainting and physical exhaustion. Doctors could find no pathogen or physical cause. Some blamed stress from strict schooling and recent independence from Britain. Others called it mass hysteria. The mad gasser of Mattoon terrified a small Illinois town in 1944, when dozens reported smelling strange gas and feeling sick. Some collapsed or became paralyzed temporarily. Police found no physical evidence of a gasser, and no suspect was ever caught. Historians now think it was a case of mass hysteria fueled by wartime nerves, media frenzy, and suggestible neighbors. In 1954 Seattle, thousands reported mysterious pits and dings in their car windshields. The damage was blamed on vandals, radiation, cosmic rays, even sand fleas. Newspapers ran frantic headlines, and police set up special task forces. But as investigators looked closer, most of the pitting turned out to be normal, where the drivers had suddenly started noticing. The windshield epidemic vanished as quickly as it began. Finally, the dancing plague of 1518 saw dozens in Strasbourg dance uncontrollably in the streets for days, some to their deaths. It was likely stress-induced mass hysteria, though some blamed ergot poisoning or demonic possession. Priests brought musicians to help dance the curse out, which may have only prolonged the misery. The Lisbon earthquake struck on the morning of November, 1755. When most of the city was at church for All Saints' Day. In seconds, stone buildings crumbled into dust, trapping thousands beneath fallen altars and shattered statues. Fires ignited from overturned lamps and scattered candles, sweeping through what was left of the city as aftershocks rattled any structure that dared still stand. The earthquake itself is estimated to have been around magnitude 8.5 to 9, one of the largest in recorded history. But the real horror unfolded as survivors ran for the harbor, only to watch the sea vanish and then return as a massive tsunami, drowning those who thought they had escaped the falling stones. Tens of thousands died in a single day, and Lisbon, one of Europe's richest cities, was reduced to ash, rubble, and ghostly silence. Just decades later, in 1883, the world would be shocked by the eruption of Krakatoa, a volcanic island between Java and Sumatra. The eruption was so powerful that it was heard nearly 30 miles away, and the sky turned blood red as ash circled the globe. Entire coastal villages were wiped away by tsunamis triggered by the explosion. Over 36 people died, but the psychological toll may have been worse. For years afterward, sunsets appeared eerily brilliant, painting the world with reminders of the disaster. Then, in 1815, Mount Tambora erupted in Indonesia with such force that it remains the largest recorded volcanic eruption in human history. The blast was heard 600 miles away. The mountain lost over 40 feet of elevation in the explosion, and the ash cloud darkened skies across the globe. Crops failed. Livestock died. 1816 became known as the Year Without a Summer, a year when frost killed harvests in June and snow fell in July in New England. Famine and disease followed. Estimates suggest over 100 people died from the eruption and its consequences, proving nature didn't need war to wage mass death. In December 2004, the Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami killed more than 230 people in 14 countries. Whole families vanished in seconds as a wall of water, taller than a building and faster than a sprinting horse, swallowed coastlines, beaches, fishing towns, resorts obliterated. Bodies were carried miles inland, and the world watched in horror as footage of the wave rolled endlessly on the news. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s was slower, quieter, but no less merciless. A deadly combination of drought, overfarming, and wind turned America's plains into a churning sea of dust. People choked in their sleep, livestock starved, crops withered into brittle ghosts, children wore dust masks to school, and houses were buried up to the windowsills. Thousands of families fled, packing their belongings onto rickety trucks bound for California, where they faced poverty, suspicion, and more hunger. Entire communities ceased to exist, swallowed by the wind that once fed them. The Columbine massacre in 1999 shattered the illusion of safety in American schools. 2 students, armed with guns and homemade explosives, stalked the halls of Columbine High School in Colorado, murdering 12 classmates and a teacher before taking their own lives. It was shocking not just for the brutality, but because it was methodically planned, filmed, and carried out by teenagers. The news cycle replayed the chaos for weeks, and schools across the world reeled under the weight of new security measures, lockdown drills, and a lingering fear that the next tragedy could happen anywhere, to anyone. Columbine changed how society saw its children and how children saw each other. In 1995, the Oklahoma City bombing tore through the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, killing 168 people, including 19 children, in the building's daycare center. The blast was the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in U.S. history at the time, orchestrated by Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols as retaliation against the federal government. It left a 9-story crater in downtown Oklahoma City and a scar on the American psyche. The haunting image of the building's sheared facade, the charred remains of office chairs, and first responders pulling bodies from rubble became part of a generation's nightmares. Then came September 11, 2001. 4 hijacked planes, 2 towers crumbling into dust, the Pentagon in flames, nearly 30 dead in a single day. The world watched in real time as the Twin Towers fell, burying thousands beneath steel and concrete, while people leapt from windows rather than burn alive. The attack didn't just collapse buildings. It cracked open global politics. Wars followed. Surveillance states grew. Every flight became suspect. Every backpack a potential bomb. Fear spread faster than any contagion. In 2004, the Beslan school siege in Russia unfolded over 3 days of horror. Armed Chechen militants took more than 100 hostages, half of them children, in a school gym rigged with explosives. Parents waited outside in agony as gunfire crackled from within. When Russian forces stormed the building, the final death toll reached over 330, including 186 children. Charred walls, tiny shoes, blood-streaked floors, the aftermath was burned into the memory of a nation already numbed by war. The Bataclan attack in Paris, 2015, was part of a coordinated series of assaults across the city by ISIS militants. At the Bataclan Theater, gunmen stormed a rock concert, firing into the crowd and taking hostages. Outside, suicide bombers detonated near the Stade de France, and attackers shot diners and pedestrians at cafes. By the night's end, 130 people were dead, hundreds wounded, and the heart of Paris was left raw and terrified. Candlelight vigils spread across the globe, but so did fear and the gnawing realization that no city, no concert, no ordinary night out was truly safe anymore. Each of these events exposed a fracture in modern life, a moment where the veneer of civilization cracked to reveal how quickly violence, hatred, and chaos could reshape the world. They left behind memorials, documentaries, political debates, and a grim new normal of metal detectors, bomb-sniffing dogs, and silent prayers in crowded places. And they remain, decades later, proof that even in a supposedly enlightened age, the worst parts of human history are never that far behind us. The Bhopal gas disaster in 1984 remains one of the worst industrial accidents in history. In the middle of the night, a pesticide plant in Bhopal, India, leaked over 40 tons of methyl isocyanate gas into the surrounding neighborhoods. People woke to burning eyes, choking lungs, and chaos as they stumbled blindly through the streets. Thousands died within days. Estimates range from 0 to 10, 0 immediate deaths, with tens of thousands more suffering lifelong disabilities, blindness, and chronic illnesses. The company responsible, Union Carbide, offered partial compensation but never full accountability. The ruins of the plant still sit in Bhopal today, leaking chemicals into groundwater while survivors fight for justice decades later. The Love Canal toxic crisis in the 1970s began as an American dream suburb. But underneath the neatly planned houses and schools of Love Canal in Niagara Falls lay more than 20 tons of buried toxic waste from a chemical company. When rains flooded the old landfill, chemicals seeped into basements, yards, and playgrounds. Children developed rashes, birth defects, and leukemia rates soared. Residents were eventually evacuated, but the scandal shattered trust in corporations and government regulators and set off the modern environmental movement's push for Superfund cleanup laws. The Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989 dumped 11 million gallons of crude oil into Alaska's Prince William Sound after the tanker ran aground on Bligh Reef. The black slick coated over 300 miles of pristine coastline, killing hundreds of thousands of seabirds, otters, and fish. Fishing communities lost livelihoods, and cleanup efforts dragged on for years. The disaster became a symbol of corporate negligence, environmental fragility, and how a single mistake at the helm could unravel an entire ecosystem. The Deepwater Horizon explosion in 2010 was another modern horror, this time in the Gulf of Mexico. An offshore drilling rig suffered a blowout, exploded, and sank, killing 11 workers instantly. Oil gushed from the ocean floor for 87 days, releasing nearly 200 million gallons into the Gulf. The spill devastated marine life, poisoned coastlines, and cost billions in damages. Images of oil-slicked pelicans and blackened beaches sparked global outrage, and BP, the company responsible, paid record fines but struggled to regain public trust. The Grenfell Tower fire in London, 2017, was a tragedy that unfolded in real time on social media. A fridge fire in one apartment raced up the 24-story building, its exterior wrapped in flammable cladding meant to save money on insulation. Within minutes, the tower became an inferno. Residents trapped inside called loved ones as smoke-choked stairwells. 72 people died, many of them from immigrant and working-class families. An inquiry revealed years of ignored safety warnings, poor regulations, and systemic neglect of social housing tenants. The charred skeleton of Grenfell Tower remains a monument to a disaster that could have been prevented if profit and bureaucracy hadn't come before people. These events aren't ancient history or acts of war. They are the quiet, insidious tragedies born from human error, corporate greed, and government failure. They remind us that the deadliest threats are sometimes not bombs or bullets, but shortcuts, paperwork, or a silent decision in a boardroom. They are proof that vigilance, accountability, and care for the unseen corners of society aren't luxuries, they are necessities. Because when we ignore them, the consequences don't just linger. They burn, they spill, they poison, and they bury communities in grief that lasts generations.